It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, July 4th, 1777. You're standing on a wharf in Philadelphia when a warship in the river fires 13 cannons at absolutely nothing. Then the next ship fires 13. Then the next. Smoke rolls across the water. The crowd around you is screaming itself hoarse. And tonight, the sky over this city will light up with the first 4th of July fireworks in history. Here's the strange part. The thing everyone is celebrating, the birth of the United States, didn't actually happen on July 4th, and the men running the country almost forgot to throw this party at all. They started planning it 2 days before. So what really happened on the first 4th of July? And why have we been celebrating on the wrong day for 250 years? Let's rewind 1 year to the summer of 1776 and clear something up. Because the picture in your head, the Founding Fathers gathered in a hot room in Philadelphia, dramatically signing the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. That picture is wrong in almost every detail. The actual vote for independence happened on July 2nd, 1776. That's the day the Continental Congress formally decided that the 13 colonies were done with Britain. July 2nd is the birthday, and the delegates knew it. The very next day, John Adams sat down and wrote a letter to his wife Abigail that has to be one of the most impressive predictions in American history. He wrote that the 2nd of July, 1776, would be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. He predicted future generations would celebrate it as a great anniversary festival, with, and these are his words, pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. From one end of the continent to the other forevermore, guns, bells, bonfires, fireworks. He called the whole thing every backyard barbecue, every fireworks show, every parade you've ever attended. John Adams described it in a letter before any of it existed. He got exactly one detail wrong. The date. Because here's what July 4th actually was. Paperwork Day. After voting for independence on the 2nd, Congress spent 2 more days editing Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration, cutting about a quarter of it, which Jefferson took about as well as any writer takes edits. On July 4th, they approved the final wording and sent it to the printer. That's it. That's the sacred day. A document got its final sign-off and went to the print shop. Nobody signed it that day either. The famous signing, the big parchment with John Hancock's enormous signature, mostly happened on August 2nd, a month later. So America celebrates the day the press release was approved. But if nothing public happened on July 4th, 1776, no party, no bells, no crowd, then when did ordinary people actually hear the news? And what did they do when they heard it? That happened 4 days later, and it's arguably the moment the celebration was really born. Monday, July 8th, 1776, around noon. Bells ring across Philadelphia, calling people to the yard behind the Pennsylvania State House, the building we now call Independence Hall. A militia officer named Colonel John Nixon steps up in front of the crowd and, for the first time anywhere, reads the Declaration of Independence out loud to the public. When, in the course of human events, all men are created equal. The whole thing straight through to a crowd of tradesmen, soldiers, clerks, mothers holding babies, most of whom couldn't read it themselves, and all of whom understood they were now, legally speaking, traitors to the British crown. The crowd cheered, muskets fired. Bells rang late into the night, and that evening Philadelphians pulled the king's coat of arms off the wall of the State House, carried it outside, and burned it in front of a cheering crowd, which tells you something about the mood. This wasn't a polite civic ceremony, it was a breakup, and they set his stuff on fire. Quick detour, because you're probably picturing the Liberty Bell ringing over all of this. Here's an uncomfortable fact. There's no solid evidence it rang at all. The famous story of the Liberty Bell announcing independence comes from a fiction writer named George Lippard, who made it up for a magazine story in 1847, 70 years later. Historians point out the State House steeple was in such bad shape in 1776 that ringing the big bell might not have been safe. Others, bells around the city, definitely rang. The most famous one, the one on the postcards, probably set this one out. The news spread from city to city like a wave, and every town threw its own version of the party. On July 9th, George Washington had the Declaration read aloud to his troops in New York City. His soldiers were so fired up that a crowd marched down to Bowling Green afterward and tore down a giant gilded statue of King George III on horseback. Then, and this is the detail I love, they melted it down and turned it into musket balls. By the commonly cited count, over 40,000 of them. The plan, more or less, was to fire the king back at his own army. In Savannah, they went further and held a mock funeral for King George, complete with a burial service. The man wasn't dead, they buried him anyway, so that's 1776. A legal vote on the 2nd, paperwork on the 4th, and a rolling series of spontaneous street parties from the 8th onward. But a party thrown once is just a party. A holiday needs a second year, and here's the thing almost nobody knows. The first real 4th of July. The first anniversary celebration. The one every celebration since has copied. Very nearly didn't happen. We know this because John Adams, once again, wrote it all down. In a letter the next day, he admitted that the idea of taking any notice of July 4th hadn't occurred to anyone in Congress until July 2nd, and nobody actually said it out loud until July 3rd. The man who ran the country forgot the country's birthday until roughly 48 hours before it, which, to be fair, is still better than some husbands manage with anniversaries. But once they remembered, Philadelphia went all in. On July 4th, 1777, the armed ships and galleys in the Delaware River lined up in front of the city, dressed in flags and streamers. At 1 o'clock, each ship fired a 13-gun salute, and each of 13 galleys fired 1 gun, 13 everything, in honor of the 13 states. At 3 o'clock, Congress sat down to an official dinner at the city tavern, and the dinner music was provided by a band of Hessian musicians, German soldiers hired by the British, captured at the Battle of Trenton 6 months earlier. Yes, the entertainment at America's first birthday party was the other team's marching band, performing as prisoners of war. The delegates found this delightful and said so in their letters. There were endless toasts, a ceremonial rifle salute called a feu de joie, fired by, of all people, British deserters, and a military parade through the streets. Then came the night. The Pennsylvania Evening Post reported that the celebration closed with the ringing of bells and a grand exhibition of fireworks on the Commons, a show that began and ended with exactly 13 rockets. The whole city was illuminated, meaning nearly every household put candles in their windows. The fireworks themselves were crude by our standards, mostly ground displays and simple rockets. Didn't matter. Every 4th of July fireworks show you have ever watched is a direct descendant of those 13 rockets. Boston lit up the same night. The template was set permanently: guns, bells, food, toasts, fireworks. Adams's letter made real 1 year late by his count. Now, before you filed this away as a feel-good story, let's talk about what was actually happening while those rockets went up. Because the first 4th of July was not a victory party, it was closer to whistling in the dark. At the exact moment Philadelphia was firing salutes, American troops a few hundred miles north were preparing to abandon Fort Ticonderoga, one of the most important American strongholds in the war, to an advancing British army. The fort fell within days. The news just hadn't reached Philadelphia yet. The party was, in a very literal sense, celebrating a country that was currently losing. And it gets worse. 10 weeks after the fireworks faded over the Commons, a British army marched into Philadelphia and took the city. Congress, the men from the dinner at the city tavern, grabbed their papers and ran. The city that invented the 4th of July spent the following winter under enemy occupation, with British officers sleeping in the houses that had put candles in their windows. The first 4th of July wasn't a celebration of something won. It was a bet placed in public by people who had no idea if they'd live to see the third one. And there's a harder truth underneath that one. When Colonel Nixon read the words, "All men are created equal," to that crowd in 1776, there were enslaved people standing in the audience, listening. Roughly 1 in 5 people living in the 13 colonies at that moment was enslaved. Around 500,000 human beings the Declaration did not free and, in practice, did not mean. 76 years later, the formerly enslaved abolitionist Frederick Douglass, would stand in front of a white audience and ask the question directly, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" It's worth remembering that the holiday carried that contradiction from its very first day. The fireworks were real. So was the asterisk. The war ground on, and the holiday grew up alongside it. In 1778, George Washington marked the 4th by issuing his soldiers a double ration of rum, establishing, arguably, the most faithfully observed 4th of July tradition of them all. In 1781, Massachusetts became the first state to make July 4th an official holiday, months before the war was even won at Yorktown. And once independence was real, Americans immediately did the most American thing possible. They started fighting about how to celebrate it. By the 1790s, the two political parties were holding separate, rival 4th of July parties in the same cities, each accusing the other of celebrating wrong. 230 years later, we've made essentially no progress on this. As for the date itself, July 2nd never stood a chance. July 4th was the date printed at the top of the Declaration, the date on every copy nailed to every tavern door, so July 4th is what people remembered. John Adams was reportedly so annoyed about it that he turned down invitations to 4th of July events, insisting on the 2nd. He lost that argument to history in the most spectacular way imaginable. On July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary to the day John Adams died. So did Thomas Jefferson a few hours earlier, several hundred miles away. The two men most responsible for the Declaration both died on its 50th birthday. Within hours of each other, if a screenwriter pitched that, you'd send them home. And that's the answer to the question. The first 4th of July was celebrated with warships, 13 gun salutes, a captured enemy band, candles in every window, and a fireworks show that opened and closed with 13 rockets, thrown together in 2 days by men on the losing side of a war, in a city about to be captured. Tonight, when the fireworks go off over your town, you're watching the 250th rerun of that show. Bigger rockets, better colors, same script. Guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. From one end of the continent to the other, exactly like Adams ordered. He got everything right except the date. And 2 centuries on, we kept the party and ignored the man who planned it. Which, honestly, is how most parties go.